Welcome to Liberty Action Alert with Greg Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C. A program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking to kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Greg Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C., and friends of the program all across the country. I'm Greg Seltz. Welcome to Liberty Action Alert. Today on our program, we are privileged to be speaking with Jerry Newcombe, and he's the executive director of Providence Forum, radio host, TV producer for D. James Kennedy Ministry, and an author of many books. And one of the ones I want to go talk to him about today is one he's written a long time ago. But before we get to that, welcome, Jerry.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Greg.
There's a book, and I talked to you about this before. There's a book that I used way back when I was in ministry, pastoral ministry, and it was What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? And one of the reasons why it was such a significant book for me is most people hadn't thought about the fact that a lot of their freedoms, a lot of their blessings, a lot of the things that they take for granted were the fruit of the ministry and the teachings of Jesus and the New Testament that had come to fruition in our culture. They just kind of assumed that they've always been there. And I loved the way that book explained, no, if Jesus had never been born, it'd be a much, much different world. So let me read a quote. You said it this way. In one sense, the point of this book is to say Nietzsche, Freud, Hitler, Robert Ingersoll, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, the ACLU, anti-faith college professors, Hollywood leaders who constantly denigrate Christianity and other leading anti-Christians of the past, that the overwhelming impact of Christ's life on the planet Earth has been positive, not negative. So let me ask you, is that why you wrote the book? And how do you think that book is wearing historically? Because I think it's wearing well.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that and much more. I mean, the bottom line is there are so many ways in which Jesus Christ impacted culture. And both Dr. Kennedy and I were fans of that movie called It's a Wonderful Life, where the Jimmy Stewart character gets to see what life would be like in his small little hometown.
Right.
Had he, the character George Bailey, never been born, and he made all this positive impact, and he hadn't even realized it. And we thought, wow, wouldn't that be amazing if you applied the same concept to Jesus Christ? And you just especially look at, instead of doing a church history book that goes century by century by century and all these different controversies within the church and so forth, what if we went issue by issue? So we look at, let's say, the value of human life. Did Jesus have an impact on that? Absolutely. Yeah. What about education? Oh, my goodness. Schools for the masses are basically a Christian invention. In fact, that especially took place after the Reformation, but even before the Reformation, a lot of times the local cathedrals would be the place where schools were there. They would have the cathedral schools. The universities were created in the Middle Ages to reconcile the newly rediscovered writings of Aristotle with Christian theology. They didn't always seem to mesh, and so these universities grew up in 1200 AD, when we have universities to this day. All the great major schools in America of universities were founded by Christians for Christian purposes. And they stated as such in their charters: Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton. You look at the issue of economics. Wherever Christianity is gone, people start to have a sense of personal responsibility, and it changes things. Family and family life and so forth. Christianity, again, makes huge contributions, music and the arts. And so you just go on and on and on, and you realize, wow, Jesus Christ made a mark in this world, and it continues to this day. And so, for example, if you travel, let's say, away from nations that have had Christian influence historically, and you just keep going further and further away from those, all of a sudden life becomes a lot more cheap than it was in areas where Christianity has made a huge difference.
And I love how you say that, because there's a lot of people today who are arguing against the church, that the church is nefarious, it's a nefarious entity, all that kind of stuff. We run into it all the time. And They will even use our own phrases as if they created it. Like you were just talking about education for all. I always talk about how the Lutheran Reformation, which is my heritage, the Lutheran Reformation, one of the reasons why everyone should read is because everyone needs to know the good news of the Bible. And then he's writing catechisms for everybody in the home. And again, the notion that education is for all, that was a radical thing, because it's much easier to control people if they are not educated. And so again, these folks that are talking about education for all, they don't realize it came from a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview. The other one I love, and I don't know, what do you think about this? I'm part of a First Amendment organization, Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty today. And if I'm talking to somebody who's critical of us, I usually say, "Oh, do you believe in separation?" And we use the word differentiation of church and state. And they go, "Of course," and they just, they mean it almost like the church doesn't belong. And I said, "Well, that's a New Testament idea. You know that, don't you? I didn't know you were a Christian." And that freaks them out, because the idea of give to Caesar what is Caesar's, he has a role to play from God's point of view, but it's a limited one. And give to God what is God's. And James Madison said, and organize both a public church and a public state and differentiate them, because your liberties depend on that. That's the kind of stuff where you're like, we can explain that. That flows naturally from our worldview, and it's really blessed so many. So
can I pick up on that?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I just want to give an example. Madison's good friend, of course, was Thomas Jefferson, and they were both heroes in their own day among the evangelicals, because they believed in religious liberty. Here they were in Virginia, and in Virginia they did have an established church. It was the Anglican Church, by law established. That's what the establishment of religion is referring to an established church. And both of them worked to provide religious freedom, to have that disestablished on the state level.
Right.
And anyway, here's the bottom line. Jefferson wrote a document in 1777 called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and it was adopted because his friend Madison helped shepherded it through the legislature in 1786. Okay, and in that Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, he basically says Jesus Christ, he doesn't use that phrase, he calls him the holy author of our religion, but he says that Jesus Christ is the reason we should have religious liberty, because we should follow his example. He didn't force his way on people, although he was Lord, both of body and mind, and could have chosen coercion as a means of propagating faith in him. But instead he chose, voluntary faith and reason and so forth, logic. So this is a very interesting point, because what's happening is people view some of the founding fathers, and certainly Jefferson, as being one who wanted a strict separation of church and state, by which they really mean the separation of God and state. Right. The founders did not intend that at all. I mean, they're the ones who gave us chaplains for both the legislature and the military, which is a long-standing tradition. But these are chaplains at taxpayers' expense to say prayers. And initially, of course, all the chaplains were Christians. Right. And they're the ones who declared national days of fasting and prayer. It's interesting. Jefferson, when he was president, chose not to deliver any national days of prayer and fasting and Thanksgiving. He was one of the few presidents that have not done that. But he said that was something for the states to do. Right. And when he was governor of Virginia, he did do that. And so it wasn't a matter of, some sort of anti-religious impulse. It was more like, no, the federal government shouldn't get involved in religion, and it shouldn't interfere with religion.
Well, and I always tell people,
respecting an establishment of religion or everything, the free exercise thereof. That's
and I always tell people, I said, people say, well, this is not a Christian nation. There's nothing, God's not in the Constitution. I said, no, this has always been a nation of Christians. And that's exactly how the founders thought the Constitution was to limit the government to its necessary role. And I say, well, if you limit something to like filling a pothole, does that person have to be a Christian to fill a pothole adequately? Well, that's how they thought of, and I know I'm being I'm hyperbolizing here, but that was the point. They thought the government was limited, and you and me, as religiously motivated, self-disciplined citizens seeking a virtuous life in our community, that was the character of the country. And so again, it's just nonsense when they take these phrases and they throw them back at us and we go, wait a minute. No, this actually flows from a Christian worldview. Hey, I want to talk about... You're
absolutely right. In fact, we do have a chapter in the book about government and how, Christianity impacted government. And then also even a chapter on government and civil liberties and how civil liberties were impacted by Jesus Christ. I mean, a lot of people forget that Martin Luther King, for example, was the Reverend Martin Luther King. Right. He was a Baptist minister in the Baptist tradition. You watched that speech he gave in August of 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial, I Have a Dream and so forth. It's really almost more of a sermon than it is a speech. It's beautiful. And in fact, within a minute or two, he quotes the book of Isaiah. Now, he doesn't say Isaiah says in chapter 40, but he says, every mountain, shall be brought down, and every valley shall be exalted. And in other words, what it means is the humble, those who humble themselves shall be exalted, but those who exalt themselves shall be humbled. Yeah. A common biblical theme, and he was quoting directly from Scripture, and his whole movement was a church-based movement. You just watch the videos of the marchers and so forth, and you see a lot of priests, including priests in the Lutheran tradition, the Catholic tradition, etc.
Yeah, and Richard John Newhouse, a big part of that. And he was one. He was an LCMS guy at one time. Then he became a Catholic. But it's really interesting too. Like you brought that up, that these things flowed from these foundational truths of the Scripture, and they flowed into society. And again, Madison even claimed that Luther was the forerunner of the Bill of Rights. Just because of his two kingdom differentiation and all that. See, this is just powerful stuff, and our church needs to understand this, because right now we're being pushed out of the culture, I think, because there's this narrative out there that the church is a nefarious entity, we're backwards, we don't understand progress, all of these things. And I'm saying, no, we're the virtuous ability to deal with progress so it doesn't destroy us, but it blesses us. So we have to take back the narrative. And that's what we're teaching our people. We're teaching our people, you have to rise to the occasion, because you can't let lawyers and politicians do this. Eventually they'll give way. We just saw that with the I call it the Disrespect for Marriage Act, where we had senators who really believe in our view of marriage. They really believe that marriage is more than a relationship. It's an institution. It's foundational to a civil society. And they voted against it. They voted for the destruction of that view or the diminution of that view. And so I tell my people, you got to go upstream. You got to go upstream in culture, and you got to take back the narrative, and you got to be able to argue why this view of marriage is better for everybody. You got to argue that pro-life is better for everybody. So let's talk about a couple of things like that. Sure. That I think would be helpful. One of them was I saw an interview with Jordan Peterson and this woman who's very, very accomplished. I think she's a PhD. She's interviewing him. And he was talking about women and their value in society. And he was talking about the Bible. And she immediately said, well, that book's misogynistic. And he said, no, it's not. And she said, yes, it is. And no matter what he said, she couldn't get past the word submission, even though the Bible talks about women's submission and men's submission in a healthy relationship. But my point was, Peterson was saying that before the biblical view of these things, you had women were treated like they weren't even people. And now you have this Bible verse that says they were created in the image of God and they were equal, but they were different. And so he's trying to get across to her that was the seedbed of her very freedom. So talk about like value of women, value of life, some of the things that you express in the book and how it changed because people started to think differently.
Well, one of the lines that we had in the book, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born, which I co-wrote with Dr. D. James Kennedy, one of the lines said that Gloria Steinem, had she survived childhood, might likely be wearing a veil today, if Jesus had never been born. I mean, it just, wherever the gospel has gone and penetrated, women's rights and women's value to women has been elevated. It's just true. Just travel around different places. I mean, for example, when William Carey, the first evangelical minister to go over to India and begin the modern missions movement about 200 years ago, in earnest, 210 years ago. So he, one of the things that he discovered that was very sad and very terrible and was a longstanding tradition, the Hindus had this practice called sati. And the
Right.
way it would work is when a husband would die, then the wife was expected to voluntarily jump on and be burned to death her husband's funeral pyre. If she didn't do it voluntarily, then a lot of times she was forced to do it. She was burned to death. And as Vishal Mangalwadi, a Christian apologist from India, said, a lot of times what this really boiled down to is these older men would marry these young teenage girls, and they would die, and then this girl, maybe even in her 20s or whatever, and she's forced to die. And William Carey saw this, and he tried to get the British government, which the British Empire was controlling parts of India at that time, and he tried to get them to stop this. And they were like, no, we're only there mainly for commerce, the East India Tea Company.
Right, right.
So, stop bothering us about these cultural issues.
Yeah.
But Carey just kept going with this. And finally, they were able, they made a law against sati. By the way, with the resurgence of some of the Hindus want to bring back the practice of sati, but every time you see an Indian woman, she should thank God, thank Jesus Christ, quite frankly,
Right.
that she has her life, because so many of these women were burned on their funeral pyres, and that's just one example among many where Christianity elevated the status of women.
Well, and I love you have a chapter called "The Civilizing the Uncivilized," and the reason why I enjoyed that is because Germans were not, and I'm of German extraction as well as Finnish, and before Christ, and Germany was the great unwashed. We were the rebels. We were, and so it to come to fruition finally with a guy like Luther, who translates the Bible, who says Christ alone, grace alone, faith alone, Christ alone. It's what ultimately matters. In even some of the high culture that developed from that, of course, it went bad, obviously, with Hitler and the socialist movement. But he hated the church. But you think about that, and you talked about how all of us, without Christ, there go we. It's the civilizing of us, the raising up of our value, the understanding of human beings as valuable people that need to be served in the name of God for one another. These things are such powerful things, but they're rooted in this. You take away these foundational principles, you take away even Christ himself, and these things go away. And I think people don't think that's going to happen. I think they think we can have all these beautiful things, destroy the narrative that and the truth that gave it to us, and still have it. Talk about what I mean, because I know this. Well, you take away Christ, and this stuff goes.
You just brought up Hitler and the Nazis. I mean, that's almost a perfect example, textbook example. Hitler and the Nazis wanted to speed up evolution as they saw it. They wanted to create the master race. They wanted to therefore kill people that they viewed as subhuman, in the whole Darwinian scheme as they interpreted it. And so therefore they killed large sections of, obviously millions of Jews. They killed gypsies. They killed Slavs. They killed Christians.
They killed Germans.
Program.
They killed Germans. They killed, like you said.
Their killing, in fact, began with the severely handicapped.
Right.
They killed about 200,000 people, including many Germans, and some of them were even veterans of World War I who had been permanently injured because of their service. Thank you for your service. Bye-bye. In fact, Zyklon B gas, which was used in the concentration camps to exterminate millions of people, especially the Jews, the highest subgroup, no question about it. But that was first developed to kill the handicapped people. The idea of all that, there is no God, or if there's gods, it's like the Norwegian gods, the Norse gods, the ones that Wagner, exalted in his operas. By the way, Hitler was a big fan of Wagner operas and would go in those and spend hours and hours. You can read all of this in the book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by Schirrer.
Right.
And anyway, that's sort of where it was during the Wagner operas that he felt like he was getting his calling, which is a very interesting thing. And so those gods of, Thor and Odin, and we still have, by the way, in our culture, there are still remnants or reminders of those things. Thursday is Thor's day. That's where it comes from, that name of that Norwegian god. But this is so interesting, though, because what Hitler wanted to do was essentially get Germany back into the paganism before Christian missionaries had come and set foot on German soil. He rued the day that Christians had made a difference, and so they did everything they could to de-Christianize Germany. For example, I mean, you can read this again in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. They wanted the Bible replaced in the churches, and instead they would have Mein Kampf. Instead of having a cross, they would replace it with the swastika and then also with a sword. And so anyway, bottom line is Jesus Christ was banished from his own land. Even they would even have Christmas trees, but they weren't called Christmas trees, or because we don't want to have anything to do with Jesus and so forth. Jesus was Jewish. If Hitler could have gotten his hands on Jesus, he would have killed him too. Because there was nothing a Jewish person in Nazi Germany could do. Once it was discovered that they were Jewish, there was nothing they could do. There was no redemption available. There was nothing. You have bad blood coursing in your veins, or so they thought. You are not a pure Aryan. You're not Nordic. In fact, when my wife is from Norway, I've been to Norway 14 times. I love Norway. It's almost like a sub-adopted home. It's over. A lot of Lutherans there. Greg.
That's right. That's right.
And we were married in a Lutheran church and a bilingual service. Yeah, I do. Well, Hitler took over Norway mainly so we could have greater access to Sweden, to the iron ore from a certain part in Sweden. And so anyway, so he took over, and one of the things he thought was, hey, you guys are Nordic. You're like pure Aryans. We're Aryans. We're going to create this Aryan paradise. And the Norwegians are like, get lost. Yeah. They wanted their freedom. And the Norwegians they did a great job trying to undermine every way that they could. In fact, there's a fantastic museum in Oslo called the Resistance Museum. And it's dedicated to those brave Norwegians that resisted against the Nazis, who had complete control over their country. And it even says in that museum, it was because of the Christian culture of the people of Norway that they were able to resist, as they did for 5 long years. Well,
and I think that's the point we want to make too, to the people. Listen, the truth is truth, and like even D. James Kennedy used to say, truths transform. And so there's that sense where no matter what these lies have consequences, and truth has consequences. And so there's a sense when we stand for the things. God created the world, God ordered the world, it's his world, and as we align ourselves with that, beautiful things happen. We can't save ourselves that way. We call that God's preserving work, but it opens us up to then his incredible saving work. But my point is that fighting for these things, taking this narrative back, is not just something for the sake of the church. Our culture needs us to do this because we can go over the edge. And that's what you were talking about. How, people didn't realize that even high culture in Germany couldn't save them. It went Wagner's way, which produced Hitler, who then rejected everything that had created the high culture in Germany in the first place. And so that's what I want. I want our people to read your book. And I want them to get to understand in all these different ways, civil rights, human rights, the value of life, the value of women, the uniqueness of marriage, the value of men who actually do what God wants them to do. All of those things and more are in this book. And it's time we take the narrative back too, because our culture is not going to be saved just through legal stuff and politics, folks.
Solzhenitsyn said that one time, he was overhearing some peasants arguing with each other. Why have all these bad things happened in Russia and to Russia? And one of the peasants said, it's because we have forgotten God. That's why all these bad things are happening. He said, I have not found any explanation better than that peasant's explanation about why all the bad things happened to us in the Soviet Union. It's because we have forgotten God. And, take away Jesus Christ from the equation, and you can end up with something like the Soviet Union. Remove Jesus Christ, remove Christian influence from society, and you could literally unlock the forces of hell.
Well said. Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL-DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Greg Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Action Alert with Greg Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.